Mason Cole sat in the dim light of a bar, nursing a glass of whiskey. His eyes traced the rim of the glass, but his mind was far away, caught in a spiral of memories he couldn't escape. His hands, rough from years of combat, gripped the glass with an intensity that betrayed his inner turmoil. He had left the military 2 years ago, but the ghosts of his past still clung to him like a second skin. The small town where he had settled, far from the chaos of his former life, provided him with little solace. The quiet was suffocating, and the mundane nature of civilian life was a daily reminder of how far he'd fallen from the person he once was. At least in the military, he'd had a purpose. Now he was adrift, working odd jobs just to make ends meet. The job of guarding celebrities, where he had been forced to babysit rich and spoiled individuals, had left him bitter, a mere shadow of the man he once was. It was during one of those restless nights, fueled by his frustration and his ever-looming doubts, that he received the call. The offer came out of nowhere. A voice on the other end, calm and precise, offered him a job, no interviews, no questions, just a simple contract. Shadow Corp. They didn't need to say more. The money was enough to make anyone listen. $500,000 a year, Mason, plus bonuses. The voice had said, "You'll be working security, consulting on high-risk situations with complete discretion." The figure seemed absurd. It wasn't just the money, it was the weight of it, the weight of being pulled back into the shadows he'd been trying to escape. But the voice was persuasive, and Mason knew better than anyone that the temptation of wealth could drown out any moral objections. The call ended with a promise. "Come meet us. We'll show you the opportunity." The contract came with an address. A rundown building tucked away in an industrial part of town. It was barely noticeable, standing in stark contrast to the skyscrapers and neon lights that surrounded it. Inside, Mason was greeted by two men in sharp suits who didn't introduce themselves. One of them handed him a thick envelope with papers. The other, a man with a permanent scowl, simply said, "Sign here." No small talk. No handshake, just business. The figures in the room remained distant, as if they were aware of the value of silence. As Mason read through the contract, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were no specifics, just broad strokes. High-risk consulting and specialized security were all the document offered in terms of description. The financial terms, however, were more than enough to make him overlook the vague nature of the job. A figure like Mason wasn't unaccustomed to shady deals, but the level of wealth they were promising was too great to ignore. In the back of his mind, he knew better. No one gave that kind of money without expecting something in return, something Mason would likely find himself trapped in. As Mason signed the contract, his mind raced with questions he was too afraid to ask. Was he really going to walk away from everything he'd worked for? The discipline of the military, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose. Was that all so easily thrown away for a paycheck? Money had always been a tool, something he'd never cared about until now. He had learned to fight for a cause, to protect others without expecting anything in return. But now, as he looked at the number printed on the contract, a part of him wondered, was this the price of redemption? Was the opportunity to leave his past behind worth the compromise of his integrity? The tension in the air was palpable, a silent acknowledgement that money, while providing temporary relief, often came at a higher cost than one was willing to pay. For Mason, the choice felt suffocating. He could walk away, continue his life on the fringes, scraping by, haunted by his past, Or he could take the job, live comfortably, but be bound by the consequences of his actions. In the back of his mind, the whispers of his military training pushed him forward. He was a soldier, a man who was used to taking orders without question. This was no different, but even as he signed the papers, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment his life would shift permanently. Mason's first day at Shadow Corp was disorienting. He arrived at a nondescript building in the heart of the city, a place that looked more like an office complex than a top-secret operation headquarters. But the absence of any clear signs or logos, combined with the stark, utilitarian architecture, gave off a cold, corporate feel that unnerved him. The kind of place where people went to disappear, where secrets were buried behind walls of concrete and steel. He was led into an elevator by a silent security guard, his movements precise, as if trained to act without thought. The elevator ride was long, the hum of the machinery echoing in the silence. As the doors opened on the underground floor, Mason was greeted by a sterile hallway, the white lights above casting harsh shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. The hallway opened into a vast room, far larger than Mason had imagined, filled with computers, surveillance equipment, and walls lined with monitors displaying endless streams of data. The space felt too quiet, too controlled, as if even the air was carefully calibrated. Mason's eyes flitted to the large glass panes that separated this command center from the rooms beyond, where various individuals worked at their stations in complete silence. He wasn't sure whether they were watching the data streams or something else, something far darker. Victor Ramirez, the man who had recruited him, met him there. He was dressed in a plain black suit, his demeanor cold but efficient. "Welcome to Shadow Corp, Mason. This is where you'll be working from now on," he said, his voice flat. They walked past the array of monitors and entered a smaller room at the end of the hall. Inside, Mason could see several large cages lined up against the walls, each one containing something alive. But it wasn't quite clear what. Victor motioned toward the closest cage. Inside, a creature that looked part human, part beast, twisted in a restless sleep. It had long, sharp claws, skin mottled with patches of scales, and teeth that seemed far too large for its jaw. Its eyes, when it briefly opened them, glowed an unsettling shade of amber before closing again. The sight made Mason's stomach churn, but he kept his composure. "That," Victor said, "is a shadow, one of the creatures we hunt and capture." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing nothing more than a wild animal. "Our job is to secure them, keep them contained, and transport them to the research facility." Mason's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't what he had been expecting. "I thought I'd be working as a bodyguard, helping with security for the high-profile clients you mentioned." Victor's lips curved into a thin, unreadable smile. "You are, but not in the way you imagined. Shadow Corp has operations across the world, dealing with far more dangerous things than celebrities or wealthy clients. Our real business is containment and research." Victor stepped closer to the cage, as if showing off his collection, and Mason reluctantly followed. "We're not just protecting the world from these creatures, we're studying them, harnessing their powers for the future. The government pays us to handle these beings, live specimens, for experimentation. The ones we capture are used for a variety of purposes, including genetic research and military development." Mason's stomach twisted with unease. He had thought this job was a clean break from his past, but the sight of these creatures, beings that seemed more like something out of a nightmare, made him realize he was walking into something far more dangerous than he had been led to believe. This wasn't just a security job. This was something far darker. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as Mason's jeep bounced along the dirt road that led to the small, abandoned town. The air was thick with dust, the trees barren, and the buildings ahead loomed like hollow eyes staring into the wasteland. This was Havenson, a town once vibrant but now forgotten by time, its streets cracked and buildings decaying as if the world had simply walked away. Mason had been given minimal details, just the location and a brief description of his target, a shadow that had taken refuge in the town's old district. The mission, as usual, was simple: find the creature, neutralize it, and transport it back to the Shadow Corp facility. Mason was prepared, at least in theory. He had been given the best training, equipped with state-of-the-art technology, and briefed on the creature's basic characteristics. But nothing had prepared him for the unease settling in his stomach as he drove further into the ghost town. The road became less of a path and more of a desolate scar through the land. The wind howled softly, brushing against the empty shells of buildings that once held life, now only casting long shadows in the twilight. As he reached the center of town, the feeling of being watched was inescapable. The stillness was unsettling, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood swaying in the breeze. Mason's eyes scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of life, or death in this case. He parked the jeep in the middle of a deserted street and shut off the engine. The silence felt oppressive, too loud for comfort. The town felt alive in a way as if it were holding its breath, waiting. Mason stepped out, his boots crunching against the ground. The eerie quiet was deafening as he slung his weapon, a tranquilizer rifle, over his shoulder and began walking towards the first building on his list, an old, run-down diner. Mason had been instructed to approach cautiously. The shadows were dangerous, intelligent creatures, capable of evading capture if given the chance. Their ability to blend into the environment, to move with unsettling speed, was one of the reasons they were so feared. But Mason wasn't afraid of the creatures. Not yet. He pushed the door of the diner open. The hinges groaned in protest, echoing through the building like the last sigh of a dying man. Inside, it was even darker, the windows long since boarded up. Dust clung to the furniture, old soda bottles and cracked cups littered the countertops. The smell of mildew and rot hung in the air. Just another creature to catch, Mason muttered to himself, trying to keep his mind steady. But the moment the words left his lips, he knew they were hollow. His confidence wavered, replaced by an unsettling feeling that there was something more to this hunt than simply capturing a creature. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone. From the corner of the room, something moved, too fast, too fluid, like a shadow in motion. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. A shadow. Mason's pulse quickened and his breath hitched. His eyes followed the movement, the figure now darting into the dark hallway at the back of the diner. Without thinking, Mason pursued. He reached for the tranquilizer rifle, his hand shaking slightly as he loaded it. The fear of the unknown was creeping in now. He didn't know what this creature was capable of. He'd been told the shadows were highly dangerous, but no one could truly prepare him for the visceral terror of confronting one in the flesh. He had been trained for a different kind of fight, but this wasn't a fight. This was a chase, and the predator in this game wasn't him. The creature was moving fast, but Mason's training kicked in, pushing him to act. He stepped carefully, gun raised, but as he moved deeper into the building, the shadow seemed to shift, vanish into thin air, only to appear somewhere else. It was toying with him. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and suddenly everything was quiet again. Too quiet. Mason's encounter with the shadow throws him into a world he's not prepared for. He had been trained to deal with people, with tangible threats, not the unknown, not the supernatural. The shadow's movement is fluid, unnatural, and its presence is almost alien to Mason's understanding. This forces him to confront not just the physical danger of the hunt, but the emotional turmoil that comes with dealing with things he doesn't fully understand. The fear of the unknown is pervasive throughout this part of the story. Mason's confidence begins to crack as he realizes the shadows are not just mindless beasts to be hunted and captured. They are intelligent, elusive, and capable of instilling dread in even the most seasoned soldiers. The creature's ability to appear and disappear at will forces Mason to acknowledge that he is not in control here. He is no longer the hunter. He is the hunted. Self-doubt begins to creep in as Mason questions his readiness for this mission. What if I'm not cut out for this? He wonders. He thought he could escape his past and find a new purpose, but this hunt has made him confront the real reason he joined Shadow Corp, the allure of wealth and escape from his past. Now, facing something beyond his control, he is forced to reconsider everything he thought he knew. Mason stood at the entrance of the government facility, staring at the heavy, reinforced doors. They looked like the kind of doors that led to places no one should enter, places where secrets were buried deep in cold, steel vaults. The facility itself was located on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and security. If there were any doubts about the nature of his work with Shadow Corp, this place would erase them all. The building was a fortress, far more fortified than any military base he'd ever seen. As Mason walked through the sterile corridors, his boots echoing off the concrete floors, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led deeper into a nightmare. The air inside felt thick, almost oppressive. Bright fluorescent lights bathed everything in an unsettling, unnatural glow, casting harsh shadows that seemed to creep along the walls, only amplifying the sense of unease he felt. Victor Ramirez, ever the efficient guide, led Mason through the facility. His face was grim, his demeanor businesslike. There was no small talk, no pleasantries. Victor seemed like someone who had long accepted the horrors of this place and was merely going through the motions. For Mason, every step felt heavier, each hallway colder and more desolate than the last. They arrived at a heavily secured wing, where the shadows were not just contained but studied. The air here was thick with a faint, sterile smell, metal, chemicals, and something darker. They passed several rooms with reinforced glass, and through those windows Mason could see the shadows, not just caged but strapped to tables and hooked up to machines, their bodies still twitching as scientists observed them like lab rats. Each creature was locked in place, unable to move but very much alive. Their eyes, full of confusion and pain, followed Mason as he walked past. He could hear the hum of machines and the soft beeping of monitors keeping track of their vital signs. Victor led Mason to a small observation room. The window looked out onto a large chamber where several shadows were contained, some in cages, others restrained to tables with various wires and tubes attached to them. Mason's stomach twisted at the sight. "These are the creatures we capture and study," Victor said flatly. "This is where the real work happens. We don't just catch them. We research them. We study their biology, their physiology, and most importantly, their powers. Some of these creatures have abilities that could change the world, Mason. Powers we can use to our advantage." Mason watched as a shadow, a hulking figure with glowing yellow eyes, stirred on the table. It was a grotesque sight, its body humanoid but distorted, skin stretched too tight over its bones, veins pulsating like something alive underneath its flesh. "They were human once," Victor continued, his voice eerily detached. "Just like us." Mason turned away from the window, his stomach churning. "And what happens to them once you're done with them?" he asked, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Victor's eyes shifted, and for a moment Mason saw something in his gaze, something dark, something almost guilty, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "We use them. The government wants them for research to build a better future." As Mason stood there looking at the shadows, he felt a shift in himself. The monsters in these cages weren't just creatures. They were victims, victims of a system that saw them as tools to be exploited. The violence he had been complicit in up until now didn't seem so clear-cut. The shadows were no longer just things to be captured and studied. They were beings, creatures with lives and stories he would never know. This part delves deeply into Mason's inner conflict as he faces the full reality of his role in the violence perpetrated by Shadow Corp. The shadows, once human, now reduced to specimens for experimentation, force Mason to confront his own moral dilemma. He had come here for a job, for the promise of money and a clean break from his past. But now, standing in front of these broken creatures, Mason feels the weight of what he has become. The personal trauma from his military past resurfaces as he realizes the line between monster and man is blurred. In the military, he had fought wars, but those wars had a clear enemy. Here, the enemy wasn't a country or ideology. It was life itself, the exploitation of beings for profit and control. Mason had been taught that monsters were to be fought, not studied. But now, as he stands in front of these creatures, it's clear that his role is not to fight for survival or justice. It is to enable more violence. He begins to question his motivations. Why did he really take this job? Was it just about the money? Was this really an escape from his past? The psychological toll of his work becomes increasingly apparent. The shadows aren't just threats. They are the victims of a broken system. As Mason watches them struggle, he begins to understand that he is not just part of an operation. He is complicit in their suffering. The weight of this knowledge hits him hard, and for the first time he feels guilt. Mason had been given a new assignment. This time, it wasn't just about capturing a single shadow, it was about handling one. A new type of shadow had emerged, one unlike anything Mason had encountered before. It was rumored to have the ability to manipulate emotions, to feed on the fear and regret of those who came near it. Shadow Corp was eager to test its potential. Mason was chosen for this mission, not because he was the most capable, but because he was disposable. They didn't care how much he had left to give, they just needed results. He was dropped into a remote location in the woods, miles from civilization. The air was thick with fog, and the trees towered over him, their shadows stretching long into the night. The creature had been seen near an old, crumbling cabin at the edge of the forest. Mason was tasked with capturing it alive, the usual directive. But as he made his way toward the cabin, A sense of unease clung to him. The dense fog seemed to grow thicker the closer he got to the cabin, as if the very air was conspiring to keep him from his goal. His steps felt heavier, the ground beneath him giving off a dull, wet sound with each movement. His heart pounded in his chest, and he tightened his grip on his tranquilizer rifle, knowing it might be his only defense. He reached the cabin at the edge of the woods. The old structure was falling apart, its windows shattered and its door hanging off its hinges. Inside, everything was coated with layers of dust and decay, the smell of mildew heavy in the air. But the atmosphere was thick with something else, a presence he couldn't name. It was as if the very walls of the cabin were closing in on him. He stepped cautiously inside. The floor creaked underfoot, and the oppressive silence pressed down on him. He moved carefully, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow for any sign of movement. Then he heard it, the faintest whisper. A voice, soft but unmistakable. It came from behind him, just out of sight. Mason! He spun around, but there was nothing there, just the same decaying cabin, the same eerie silence. The voice had sounded like his name, but distorted as if it had been stretched out of shape. A cold shiver ran down his spine. The shadow was here, and it was already inside his mind. Mason's pulse quickened. He had been prepared for this, or so he thought. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. From the corner of the cabin, the creature emerged. It was different from the others he had faced. It wasn't as physically imposing, but its presence was far more unsettling. Its body was long and serpentine, with black, liquid skin that seemed to shimmer with an unnatural sheen. The creature's eyes were deep, empty voids, but its smile, that wide, jagged grin, was the most terrifying part of all. Its teeth were sharp, yellowed, and its lips pulled back in a grotesque mockery of a human expression. It didn't move like other shadows. Instead, it shifted in and out of the shadows as if it were part of them, feeding off them, blending into the darkness as if it had been born from it. Its form flickered in and out of visibility, never staying in one place for too long. But it wasn't the creature's appearance that made Mason's breath catch in his throat. It was the feeling, the sensation of its influence. Mason felt a rush of fear, cold and paralyzing, creeping over him like a thick fog. His thoughts seemed to twist, and his memories, his deepest regrets, began to surface. He remembered the mistakes he made in his past, the choices he had no control over, the lives he had failed to protect. He felt the weight of his sins pressing down on him, a crushing guilt that made him feel as if he were drowning in his own conscience. "You're not the hero you think you are, Mason," the shadow whispered, its voice an echo in his mind. "You were never in control. You've always been the one who's been hunted." The creature's voice was like poison, sliding into his thoughts and planting seeds of doubt in his mind. It fed on his regret, his fear, twisting his emotions into something darker. The more he fought to keep his thoughts clear, the stronger the creature's hold became. His hands shook, and for a moment Mason wasn't sure if it was from fear or from the realization that he was truly powerless here. This creature didn't just threaten his life, it threatened his very sense of self. The weight of all his past mistakes, the lives lost in battle, the soldiers he had failed, all rushed back to him with such intensity that he couldn't tell where the past ended and the present began. The shadow smiled wider, as if feeding off his torment. The city at night was a different beast altogether, no longer the shiny, sleek metropolis of corporate buildings and neon lights, but a labyrinth of shadowed alleyways, run-down buildings, and the lingering scent of desperation. Mason had been here before, but tonight the streets felt more dangerous. The cool night air, once refreshing, now seemed to choke him as he walked through the darkened urban landscape. His mission this time was different. Instead of heading out to a desolate field or a crumbling building in the outskirts, Mason was sent into the heart of the city to capture a rogue shadow, a creature that had escaped from Shadow Corp's facility and was now being used by the criminal underworld. The city had become a breeding ground for these rogue shadows, with certain gangs and underground organizations using them as weapons, tools, and even pets. Some humans had learned to coexist with these creatures, binding themselves symbiotically in exchange for power or protection. This made Mason's job even harder. As he walked deeper into the city, the usual hum of urban life felt strangely absent. He passed by bars that never closed, neon signs flickering intermittently, casting fleeting, fractured light over the streets. The buildings towered above him, but it was the dark alleys and back doors where he knew the real action took place. He reached a dilapidated warehouse tucked behind a graffiti-covered wall, one that was well known among the underground criminal circles for housing dangerous artifacts. This is where he would find his target, the rogue shadow. Mason took a deep breath and stepped inside, the stench of decay filling his lungs. The inside of the warehouse was a mess of discarded crates and old furniture, with the faint sound of clinking metal coming from the far end. But there was something more: whispers, low, guttural sounds that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He could feel the presence of something or someone watching him. In the center of the warehouse stood a group of criminals, their faces obscured by hoods and masks. They were speaking in low voices, making deals, trading goods, and most disturbing of all, holding leashes attached to the necks of several shadows. The creatures, once terrifying monsters, were now nothing more than tools for the humans, their eyes blank but alert, waiting for commands. But it wasn't just the shadows that unsettled Mason. It was the fact that the humans had learned to live with them, to exploit them, creating a twisted partnership. The creatures were no longer the enemy. They were commodities, enslaved and used for personal gain. Mason's hand tightened around the handle of his tranquilizer rifle. He had come here to capture one of these creatures, but what did that really mean? The world he once thought he understood had started to shift beneath his feet. Was he hunting monsters, or was he hunting victims? As Mason moved deeper into the shadows, the whispers grew louder. It was then that he saw it, a large, hulking shadow pacing restlessly inside a cage. Its fur was matted, and its eyes, once filled with fear and rage, had been dulled by years of captivity. Its body was scarred from countless battles and the chains that had been used to keep it under control. The rogue shadow was a product of a system that used it and the other creatures as tools for profit. Mason's pulse quickened as he saw the rogue's handler approach the cage, murmuring commands. The shadow snarled in response, its claws scraping against the steel bars as it lunged toward the human. The man quickly backed away, laughing as though this were all some kind of twisted game. Mason was disgusted but remained hidden, watching as the criminals played with their power. He knew he couldn't let this go on. His job was simple: capture the rogue shadow and bring it back to the facility. But as he studied the creature, tired, broken, and desperate, Mason wondered if this was the right thing to do. As if on cue, one of the criminals spotted him, and the scene shifted from entertainment to danger. The warehouse doors slammed shut, and suddenly Mason was surrounded. The criminals had no intention of letting him leave with the shadow. They knew that the value of a captured creature was more than just money, it was power, and they would fight to keep it. Mason's training kicked in. He drew his rifle and fired a tranquilizer dart at the rogue shadow, hitting it square in the side. The creature let out a guttural cry and collapsed to the ground, unconscious. The criminals cursed, pulling out knives and firearms, closing in on Mason from all directions. But instead of the usual adrenaline rush Mason felt when he was up against enemies, he felt something different: unease. He was caught in a web of conflicting emotions. The rogue shadow had been a monster, a threat, yes, but it had also been enslaved and tortured. Was he really doing the right thing? The facility was silent when Mason arrived, too silent. For the first time since his induction into Shadow Corp, he felt that something was wrong. The usual bustle of people moving through the corridors, the hum of computers processing data, all of it had ceased. It was as if the life had been drained out of the building overnight. He could feel it in his bones, that unsettling stillness. Colonel William Steele, Mason's mentor, had called him in for a meeting, an impromptu one. Steele had been the one to recruit Mason into Shadow Corp, the one who had promised him that this job would give him a new purpose, far from the trauma of his past life in the military. The two had shared a bond of trust, one forged in the fire of battle. For Mason, Steele had been more than just a superior officer. He had been a father figure, someone he believed in. But that trust was about to be shattered. Mason walked down the narrow, dimly lit corridor toward Steele's office. As he approached the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just another routine meeting. Something was different. His heart rate quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm, to remind himself that he had been through far worse. He opened the door. Inside, Steele was sitting behind his desk, looking as composed as ever. But his eyes, there was something in them today, a coldness, something Mason hadn't seen before. The room felt too small now, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in around him. "Mason, come in," Steele said with a sharp, commanding tone, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. But Mason hesitated before sitting. The air felt heavy, as if the words they were about to exchange would change everything. "I need to show you something," Steele said, his voice colder than usual. He pressed a button on his desk, and a large screen on the wall flickered to life, displaying a series of confidential files and videos. At first, Mason couldn't understand what he was looking at. The images were fragmented, the footage blurry, but it was enough to make his stomach churn. What appeared to be shadows, but not the ones Mason had seen before. These were different, more human. They were confined to dark rooms, injected with strange chemicals, and subjected to horrific experiments. Their eyes, once full of fury and defiance, were now glassy and vacant. They were nothing more than subjects to be tested, manipulated, and weaponized. "What is this?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His heart sank. Steele's gaze shifted to the screen, his expression unreadable. "This, Mason, is the real purpose of Shadow Corp." Mason's breath caught in his throat. The truth was seeping through the cracks of his understanding. The shadows he had been hunting, those creatures he thought were dangerous, monsters to be contained, were actually victims. Victims of a global conspiracy, a corporate agenda to manipulate them for military and political power. They weren't just studying them for the sake of research. They were exploiting them to build weapons, to create a new kind of control over the world's governments. Steele's voice broke through Mason's stunned silence. "We've been hunting them because they are the key to controlling everything. These creatures, They are the next phase in military evolution. Think about it. No more wars, Mason. No more weapons of mass destruction. Just absolute power controlled by the corporation, by us. Mason felt his pulse surge, blood rushing to his head. You're telling me this is what we've been doing. We've been hunting them to turn them into weapons. Steele's face tightened. It's the future, Mason. It's the only way to ensure our survival in a world that's getting more chaotic by the day. Mason could feel the betrayal sting like a fresh wound. The truth was undeniable, and it shattered the image he had long held of Shadow Corp. Steele, the man he had trusted, was no better than the very criminals Mason had fought to stop. Steele had been lying to him from the start, using him as a pawn in a game much bigger than Mason had ever imagined. "What do you expect me to do with this?" Mason asked, his voice shaking. His hands balled into fists on the arms of the chair. "You've been manipulating me, using me to hunt down these creatures so you can turn them into weapons. You're no different from the monsters we've been chasing." Steele's face softened for a brief moment, a flicker of something almost sympathetic crossing his features. But then, as if brushing it aside, he straightened his back, his tone hardening. "I expect you to understand the bigger picture, Mason. You've seen the power they have. You know what they're capable of. This isn't just about survival anymore. This is about shaping the future of the world. You can be a part of that, or you can walk away. But know this, if you walk away, you'll be abandoning everything we've worked for." Mason's world felt like it was crumbling around him. His life, his choices, everything he had worked for in Shadow Corp had been built on a lie. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. "I don't know you anymore, Steele," he said, his voice steady despite the rush of anger and disbelief boiling inside him. "You're just as bad as the people we've been fighting. You're using them as tools for power, for control, and I won't be part of it." Steele's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching as he stood. "I'd be careful, Mason. You don't want to make an enemy of me. You don't want to become a problem." Mason's hand gripped the door handle. His mind was racing, thoughts spiraling into a whirlwind of confusion and betrayal. He had trusted Steele, followed his lead, and now, standing on the precipice of this revelation, he had no idea who he could trust anymore. The door slammed behind him as he exited Steele's office. But the weight of his decision felt heavier than any mission he had ever taken on. Mason had been tracking shadows for months now, moving from mission to mission, each one seemingly no different from the last. But this mission was different. This time, his orders were clear: capture, not kill. His target was a rogue shadow that had been spotted near an isolated village on the outskirts of the city. It was more than just another routine assignment. It was something darker, something more personal. Mason arrived at the village at night. The place was abandoned, much like the other ghost towns he had visited before. The buildings were decaying, their windows shattered and boarded up, and the wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of damp wood and dust. But something was off. As he made his way deeper into the village, he felt a strange sense of unease, a foreboding that clung to him like a second skin. At the heart of the village was a large, crumbling church. Its stained glass windows were cracked, and the doors hung off their hinges. Inside, the floor was covered in layers of dust, the pews warped and abandoned. Yet in the dim light of his flashlight, Mason could make out movement in the back corner of the room. There, crouched low, was the shadow. It was a hulking, twisted figure, its form humanoid but grotesque, with jagged limbs and skin that shimmered like black oil. Its eyes were the only part of it that seemed human, tired, haunted, and filled with an unbearable sorrow. But as Mason stepped closer, his heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any shadow, it was different. It wasn't the snarling, violent creature he was accustomed to. It was broken. The creature's gaze locked with his, and for a moment Mason felt a strange connection, not the usual terror or aggression, but something far more unsettling, a shared pain. He paused, unsure of what to do, his fingers tightening around his rifle. This creature, this shadow, wasn't acting like the others he had hunted. It wasn't attacking, it wasn't running, it was just there, waiting. As Mason stood there trying to steady his breath, the shadow did something unexpected. It spoke. "Please don't hurt me." Mason froze. He had never heard a shadow speak before, not in a voice like this, soft, pleading, human. It was a voice filled with fear, but also something else, something familiar. "What did you say?" Mason whispered, his voice trembling as he lowered his rifle. The words felt like a knife through his chest, the reality of the situation sinking in. This was no monster. This was no mindless creature. I wasn't always like this." The shadow continued, its voice breaking with raw emotion. "I was once a man, a soldier just like you, but the chemicals, they changed me. They changed us all." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Mason took a step back, his heart racing. The shadow wasn't just some creature to be hunted, it was someone. It had been human, just like him. This part explores the theme of identity and the blurred lines between man and monster. The shadow standing before Mason wasn't a mindless predator. It was a victim of a greater evil. It had once been a soldier, a human being with a life, a family, a purpose. But now it was a creature enslaved by a system that had used it, broken it, and turned it into something unrecognizable. Mason's entire world had been built around the idea that the shadows were dangerous, monsters to be captured or destroyed. They were other, not human, not like him. But now, as he stood in front of one of them, the truth was staring him in the face. The shadows were not monsters. They were the victims of a corrupt system that had taken their humanity from them. Mason had always seen them as enemies, but now he saw them for what they truly were, victims of Shadow Corp, who had used their powers for profit, testing, and experimentation. The real monsters, Mason realized, weren't the shadows. They were the people who had used and tortured them for their own gain. The moral conflict that Mason had been grappling with deepened as he stood face to face with the truth. The more he learned about the shadows and the atrocities they had been subjected to, the more his sense of right and wrong became complicated. Could he still be a part of this world, hunting creatures that were once human? Could he still follow orders, knowing the pain and suffering they had endured? The shadow, weak and trembling, began to cry, its body shaking as it collapsed to the floor. "I didn't ask for this, none of us did," it whispered, voice breaking. "We were soldiers, we fought for our country, and now we're just monsters." Mason stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to raise his rifle, to do what he was trained to do, capture the target. But he couldn't. The humanity in this creature, the pain it carried, was undeniable. "I'm sorry," Mason whispered, his throat tight. He didn't know what else to say. He had failed. The shadows weren't monsters. They were victims of a system that had stripped them of their humanity. And Mason had been a part of that system. He had been hunting people, not creatures. Mason's mind raced as the weight of the truth hit him. He had always seen the shadows as an enemy, something to be dealt with, something he was trained to fight. But now everything had changed. He wasn't a hero. He was part of the problem. He was the one who had been hunting victims, not monsters. The creature's words echoed in his mind. "We were soldiers just like you." Mason fell to his knees in front of the shadow, a mixture of guilt and anger building inside him. He couldn't undo the pain he had caused, but he could choose to stop it now. He could stop hunting, stop following orders. He could make a choice. Mason's footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway as he made his way through the underground facility. It had taken weeks of careful planning, of tapping into old contacts within Shadow Corp, but now he was finally here, in the heart of it all, the place where the real secrets of the shadows were buried. He reached a small, unmarked door at the end of the corridor. The security camera above it buzzed with a faint static sound as it tracked his every movement. Mason didn't hesitate. His heart was pounding, but his mind was focused. With a practiced motion, he swiped the access card that had been given to him by one of his sources, a source he trusted more than the company he had worked for. The door opened with a faint click. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with rows of computer terminals, old medical equipment, and disjointed files scattered across several desks. A large screen in the center of the room flickered on, showing a secure feed from a higher level of the facility. Mason stepped closer, his heart racing as he saw the image of shadows, dozens of them restrained and covered with monitoring devices, their bodies twisted, marked by countless surgical scars. Mason's eyes widened as the screen shifted to another file. The documents were labeled with clear government markings: confidential, top secret, phase 3. He squinted at the text, his fingers trembling as he read. It was a project called Shadow Soldier, Super Soldier Creation. The file detailed experiments where shadows were genetically altered. But the most shocking part came next. The shadows were not just monsters to be contained. They were human, transformed into experiments by the government to build an army of genetically enhanced soldiers. The document spoke of genetic splicing, DNA manipulation, and the creation of biological weapons designed for global control. Mason felt his stomach turn. The room seemed to close in on him, and he staggered back as the weight of the revelation sank in. These creatures, these beings he had been hunting, were once human. Soldiers just like him. They had been forced into these experiments, twisted into something unrecognizable, all for the purpose of power and control. The government had taken them, stripped them of their humanity, and now they were being used to create the next generation of soldiers. The anger built in Mason's chest, rising like a tidal wave. He had spent months hunting these creatures, capturing them, delivering them to be experimented on, never once questioning why. Now, standing in this room, the truth was undeniable. He had been part of the problem. He had been contributing to a system that used and abused these shadows, pushing them beyond the limits of their bodies and souls. He rushed to the terminal, hacking into the system with the expertise he had honed over the years. He pulled up the latest classified files, the final reports on Project Shadow Soldier. It was all laid out in front of him. Shadow Corp wasn't just a corporation. It was a front for a government-backed initiative to weaponize the shadows, to create biological super soldiers that could change the course of global warfare. Mason's hands shook as he read through the files. The last report confirmed what he feared the most. The shadows weren't just being hunted. They were being created, engineered, and manipulated for the sole purpose of becoming weapons for political and military power. They were nothing more than pawns in a game he had unknowingly been a part of. He pulled his phone from his pocket and began to type a message. But as he looked back at the screen, the weight of his actions settled in his chest. He had been complicit. He had been hunting people, not monsters. Just as Mason was about to send the message, the door behind him clicked open and he spun around, heart pounding. The shadow of a figure filled the doorway. Colonel Steele. His face, as always, was calm and composed, but his eyes held something new, a coldness Mason had never seen before. "Mason," Steele said softly, stepping into the room. "I see you found it. I've been wondering how long it would take." Mason stared at him, the truth hitting him like a punch to the gut. The man he had trusted, the man who had been like a father figure to him, had known all along. Steele had been a part of this. He was complicit in the project, orchestrating it from the inside. "You knew about all of this," Mason's voice cracked. "The government, the experiments, the shadows, you used them to create weapons." Steele didn't flinch. He simply nodded, a grim smile forming on his lips. "You're too late, Mason. This was always the plan. The world is changing and Shadow Corp is at the center of it. You've been part of this revolution, whether you realized it or not. Your role wasn't to question, it was to serve. And you've done it well." Mason took a step back, his mind spinning. He had trusted this man, believed in the cause, and now that trust had been shattered. "Why?" Mason's voice shook. "Why turn them into this? They're not weapons, they're people. We're no different." Steele's gaze softened, but his words were hard. "The shadows are tools, Mason, and tools are meant to be used. The world needs power, and we are the ones who will wield it. You should have known this from the start. But now I see you've made your choice. It's too late to turn back now." Mason felt the weight of betrayal and shame crash down on him. He had been part of the lie, part of the machine that had created this nightmare. And now, there was no going back. The sharp crack of gunfire pierced the air, and Mason's heart raced as he ducked behind the crumbling stone wall. The dust and smoke swirled around him in the sweltering heat of the Middle Eastern desert. The battle was raging. His unit was surrounded, pinned down by enemy fire from all directions. He could hear the cries of his comrades, the sound of gunshots, and the constant chatter of the radio in his ear. "We need backup," came the frantic voice of his sergeant, but the transmission cut off as another explosion rocked the building nearby. Mason's head was spinning. He was exhausted, his body covered in sweat and blood, but there was no time to rest. The mission wasn't over. The enemy had to be neutralized. "We move now," Mason shouted, rallying the few remaining soldiers with him. He could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty in their movements. This wasn't the way it was supposed to be. This wasn't a routine assignment. This was chaos. As Mason led his team out of cover and toward the enemy's position, a bullet struck his leg, throwing him to the ground. The pain was blinding, but he couldn't afford to stop. There was no room for fear, no room for hesitation. He had to keep going. He had to push through. The flashbacks hit him like a sledgehammer. The faces of the men he had fought beside, the ones who never came home. The memories were always there, lurking in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the choices he made and the consequences they brought. Faces of comrades who had died under his watch, faces of civilians who had been caught in the crossfire, their lives shattered because of the violence he had been a part of. Scene 1. A mission gone wrong. The scene shifted. Mason was kneeling beside the body of his best friend, Jake, in a dimly lit hospital tent. The sound of soldiers scrambling around them was distant, muffled by the rush of adrenaline in Mason's veins. Jake had taken the hit in a firefight, a clean shot to the chest. Mason's hands were shaking as he tried to stop the bleeding, but it was no use. Jake's breathing was shallow, his eyes clouded, fading fast. "Stay with me, Jake," Mason had pleaded, his voice cracking. Jake's lips parted into a weak smile. "You'll be okay, Mason, you always are." But that was the last thing Jake had said. Mason watched, helpless as the life drained from his best friend's eyes. The guilt hit Mason like a fist. The question haunted him for years. Could I have saved him? Scene 2, the civilian casualty. The next flashback was a scene Mason had tried to bury deep within himself, one he couldn't run from, no matter how hard he tried. Mason was part of a team assigned to neutralize a target in a small village. Intel had reported enemy combatants hiding in a cluster of houses. The operation had been swift, but things quickly spiraled out of control. A child, no older than 10, had stepped into the line of fire. Mason had been the one to pull the trigger, believing it was the enemy, but it wasn't. The child had been innocent. She had died in an instant, her body falling to the dirt, and Mason never forgot the terrified expression frozen on her face. "I didn't mean to." The words never left his lips. The reality of what he had done had overwhelmed him. He had murdered a civilian. This was the price of war. A price Mason had learned to pay, but the cost was always there, lingering, never fading. Mason had never felt more out of place than he did now, standing in the middle of Shadow Corp's headquarters, a towering, sterile building that symbolized everything he had come to despise. He had seen its cold, mechanical side before, the way it treated the shadows, the way it fed on suffering for profit. But today, he wasn't just walking through its halls. Today, he was standing at the crossroads of his life and death. The doors to the executive boardroom slid open with a hiss, revealing the leadership of Shadow Corp seated around a large, polished table. At the head of the table sat Colonel Steele, Mason's former mentor, his cold eyes locked onto Mason's as if waiting for him to make a move. "You've gone too far, Mason," Steele said, his voice low but cutting. "You've seen what happens when you defy the system. You know how this works. The shadows are a means to an end. You can either be part of that end or you can be crushed under it." Mason took a deep breath, his fists clenched by his sides. He knew what Steele was offering, a way out, a chance to walk away from the mess he had gotten himself into, a chance to survive. But that survival would come at a cost. Behind Steele sat the other key players of Shadow Corp, their faces unreadable. They weren't here to negotiate, they were here to make a decision. And that decision was whether Mason would continue to serve as a pawn in their game or if he would become a threat to their power. "Do you think you can stop us?" Another figure, Director Lansing, sneered. "We control everything. The shadows, the government, the money, it's all ours. You think you can just walk away from this? You think anyone is going to believe you if you expose us?" Mason's eyes flicked to the back of the room where a small, hidden panel displayed the live feed from the facility's security cameras. He knew that the shadows were being held in cages, ready to be tested again, ready to be used as weapons. But his thoughts weren't on the shadows at this moment, they were on his choices. His soul. Mason stood there, staring down the barrel of a decision that would change the world and him with it. The path of survival was clear. Accept the leadership's offer, align with Shadow Corp, and continue the work he had been doing, using the shadows for their agenda. But to do so would mean complicity, to betray the very essence of what he had believed in, to lose his soul in exchange for a life that no longer mattered. The other path, the one that threatened his very survival, was heroism. To risk everything to stop this machine of corruption, to expose the evil that had pervaded Shadow Corp from within, and free the shadows from their torment. It was the path of self-sacrifice, where Mason could no longer be part of this dark system, no matter what it cost him. His mind flashed back to the faces of the shadows he had encountered, the ones who had pleaded for mercy, the ones who had been experimented on like lab rats. Those faces haunted him, pushing him toward a decision that was almost too difficult to bear. The choice Mason faced was not just about survival. It was about what kind of man he wanted to be. Could he turn his back on his morality, his humanity, and continue working for an organization that used innocent creatures as pawns in a global game of power? Or could he find it in himself to make the ultimate sacrifice, to stop the machine, expose the truth, and stand for something bigger than himself? Steele's voice broke through his thoughts. If you walk out that door, Mason, there's no turning back. You'll be a marked man, you'll be hunted, and we won't hesitate to eliminate you just like the others who have tried to stand in our way. For a moment, Mason faltered. The fear was there, deep, buried beneath his resolve, but it didn't matter. Fear was his constant companion. It had always been there, even in his days on the battlefield. It was a force he had learned to live with, but it had never stopped him from doing what was right, and it wouldn't stop him now. You think you can scare me with threats? Mason's voice was steady, his gaze unwavering as he took one final step into the room. I've already seen what happens when good men stand by and do nothing. I've been a part of this evil system long enough. The silence was deafening as the room's weight of tension thickened. I'm done running. Mason's words were heavy but full of resolve. I'm not going to keep hiding behind this corporate facade anymore. I won't be your pawn. The shadows, the creatures we've hunted, they are victims, and they won't suffer anymore because of people like you. Steele's eyes narrowed, his hands tightening around the arms of his chair. You don't understand. Mason, you never did. Mason took another step forward, determination burning in his chest. I understand more than you think, Steele, and that's why I'm stopping this. He pulled out the data drive that had taken him weeks to acquire, the evidence of everything Shadow Corp had done. The experiments, the manipulation, the weaponization of the shadows. It was all documented. All of it would be exposed, and Mason was going to be the one to bring it to the world. But Steele wasn't finished. The air in the room seemed to change as he stood and spoke again, his voice quieter but colder. You think you can just walk away from this. You think the world will accept you. You'll be nothing, Mason, just another ghost. I'm not afraid to be a ghost, Mason said, his voice firm and steady, because that's exactly what I've been for too long. The battlefield was unlike anything Mason had ever experienced. Gone were the traditional war zones of his past, the dusty desert fields and concrete jungles where bullets and bombs were the only language. Now, he found himself standing at the epicenter of a supernatural conflict, the world itself trembling under the weight of the clash between Shadow Corp and the surviving shadows. It was dusk, the sky a bruised mix of purple and orange, casting long shadows over the abandoned city where the final confrontation was set to unfold. The streets, once filled with the bustle of life, were now eerily silent. Buildings that had stood for decades were crumbling, their structures shattered by the ravages of war. The air itself felt thick with tension, the kind of palpable fear that came from knowing something monumental was about to happen. Mason had spent the last few days trying to avoid this moment. The surviving shadows, many of whom he had once seen as enemies, had gathered to fight for their freedom against Shadow Corp, the very organization that had enslaved and experimented on them for years. Mason had learned of the Shadows' rebellion, a last-ditch effort to reclaim their lives and bring down the organization that had corrupted everything they were. And now, Mason was caught in the middle. At his back, the elite forces of Shadow Corp prepared for battle. Their orders were clear: eradicate the surviving Shadows and secure total control. But ahead of him stood the Shadows themselves, ready to fight not only for their survival but for their dignity and freedom. There was a humanity to their cause that Mason had never fully understood until now. They weren't monsters. They were victims just like him. They had been manipulated, experimented on, and forced into battle for a war that wasn't theirs to fight. Mason's eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. He had already made his decision once, hadn't he? He had chosen to stand against Shadow Corp to expose the truth. But this battle, this war, wasn't just about exposing the corruption anymore. This was about a choice between personal survival and the greater good. Mason's choices had always been defined by the gray areas of morality. He had been a soldier, following orders, doing his duty. He had been part of a system that had betrayed him. But now, the line between right and wrong seemed even more difficult to navigate. On one side, the Shadows, the victims, the ones who had suffered under Shadow Corp's twisted experiments. Their desire for freedom was genuine, but their actions, their fight, would come at a high cost. If they succeeded in bringing down Shadow Corp, they would free themselves, but the chaos that would follow could engulf the world in darkness. Would the Shadows become the new oppressors? Would their quest for revenge and freedom lead to another cycle of violence, just as it had with the humans who had abused them? On the other side, Shadow Corp, the entity that had once been a source of power and a force of order in Mason's life. Their reach extended beyond what Mason had initially understood, and their methods were far from noble. But they were still a powerful force. They offered stability, a semblance of control, a way of life that could protect the world from the chaos the Shadows represented. However, this protection came at the cost of freedom, the very thing Mason had fought to give to the Shadows. Could Mason really trust Shadow Corp after everything he had uncovered? Could he live with the injustice of continuing to serve an organization that had manipulated him and used the Shadows as pawns? The stakes couldn't be higher. Mason could take up arms with the Shadows and fight for their freedom, knowing the price might be global instability, a world torn apart by supernatural war. Or he could stand with Shadow Corp, suppress the Shadows, and continue to ensure the status quo, knowing that thousands of innocent lives would continue to suffer in the name of power and control. The tension was suffocating. Mason was stuck in a moral dilemma that no soldier had ever been prepared for. Could he take down Shadow Corp and let the Shadows have the freedom they deserved? Or was the cost too high? Was it possible that all sides were corrupted? Were the Shadows truly the heroes in this story, or were they just another version of the monsters they had once feared? The first shots rang out, a deafening explosion that shattered the silence and sent debris flying through the air. Mason didn't hesitate. He reached for his weapon, feeling the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for meaning. He moved swiftly, darting between the wreckage, his eyes scanning the battlefield. Ahead of him, the Shadows were clashing with Shadow Corp's forces, their inhuman forms moving with terrifying speed and strength. They were fierce, but they were also desperate. The need for freedom, the desire to be rid of the chains that had bound them for so long, had pushed them to the brink. But in the chaos of the battle, Mason couldn't help but wonder, was this their last chance for salvation, or was this the beginning of a greater destruction? Mason's head throbbed, the weight of his decision threatening to overwhelm him. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant in this war. He was a leader standing at the precipice of an unknown future. As the battle raged on, Mason spotted Victor Ramirez, his old comrade, standing on the front lines of the Shadow Corp forces. Their eyes met for a brief moment, a silent understanding passing between them. Victor had once been a soldier, a man Mason trusted. But now, he was a cog in the machine, a man who had chosen survival over morality. Would Mason join him, or would he fight against the system he had once upheld? "Mason," Victor shouted, waving him forward. "You don't have to do this. We can still stop it. Join us. Fight for the future." But Mason stood firm, the truth of everything he had learned over the last few months echoing in his mind. "I've already made my choice, Victor," Mason said, his voice hard with resolve. "And you should have made yours too." He raised his weapon, not to fire, but to take aim at the heart of the conspiracy. The night had fallen over the crumbling city, its once thriving streets now a war zone. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of burning metal and flesh lingering in every breath. The sound of gunfire and roars of fury echoed through the ruined buildings, reverberating off the empty walls. This was it, the final battle. Mason stood at the center of the chaos, his heart hammering in his chest as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. Around him, the shadows, the very creatures he had once hunted, captured, and feared, were now his allies. Together, they fought back against the overwhelming forces of Shadow Corp, determined to end the tyranny they had endured for so long. It wasn't just the Shadow's survival that was at stake, it was Mason's redemption. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just fighting for his own survival, he was fighting for something greater, for the freedom of the creatures he had wronged, and for the freedom of the world from the grasp of a corrupt, power-hungry corporation. The battlefield stretched out before him, illuminated by the flickering flames of destroyed vehicles and the glow of supernatural powers as the shadows unleashed their abilities against Shadow Corp's elite forces. The ground trembled as the battle raged on, each blow, each strike, carrying with it the weight of everything Mason had done. Mason gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on his weapon. He wasn't the same man who had entered the war all those months ago. He was no longer a soldier obeying orders. He was a man fighting for justice, fighting for redemption, fighting for a future where the shadows could live free, unchained, and unafraid. This battle wasn't just about survival. It was about the fight for redemption. Mason had spent most of his life running from his past, hiding behind the justifications of war and the power of Shadow Corp. But now, standing shoulder to shoulder with the very creatures he had once viewed as enemies, he realized that his survival depended not on winning this battle, but on redeeming himself for the atrocities he had helped perpetrate. The shadows weren't just fighting for their freedom, they were fighting for the right to exist, to live without fear, to live without the looming threat of Shadow Corp's control over them. And Mason, who had once been an instrument of that control, now found himself fighting alongside them. But redemption wasn't easy. It came at a price, and that price was steep. Mason's decisions, every choice he had made in the fight for freedom, had led him to this point. Would he survive this final battle? Would he win the war not just for the shadows but for himself? Or would he lose everything, his life, his soul, his future? The moment of reckoning had arrived. Mason darted through the ruins, his legs moving faster than he had ever thought possible. His heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline flooding his veins. He could hear the sounds of clashing swords, the shrieks of shadows as they took down Shadow Corps soldiers in brutal combat, and the ominous hum of military-grade weapons coming from the enemy forces. Mason's eyes narrowed as he spotted his objective. Colonel Steele, the leader of Shadow Corps. The man who had manipulated him, used him as a pawn, and now tried to crush the very creatures he had once hunted. Steele stood at the head of the corporation's remaining forces, a symbol of the oppression that had plagued the world for so long. But now Mason knew the truth, and he would stop Steele once and for all. The colonel caught Mason's gaze and smiled coldly as if daring him to make a move. "You think you can stop this, Mason?" Steele's voice was a low growl. "You think you can destroy everything we've built? You've always been weak. You don't have what it takes to change the world." Mason stepped forward, his eyes burning with a fire that had never been there before. "I'm not the one who's weak, Steele," he said, his voice steady but his heart hammering. "I've seen what your system does. I've seen what you've turned these creatures into, and I'm done with it." With one swift motion, Mason raised his weapon and fired at Steele's guards, taking them down one by one. Steele, ever the strategist, moved quickly, ducking behind the cover of a nearby wreckage. "You think killing me will stop it?" Steele sneered. "The truth is, Mason, you're just like me. You've always been, you just didn't know it yet." Mason didn't hesitate. He didn't stop to listen to Steele's words or to the taunts about his past. He knew what he had to do. He pushed forward, his resolve stronger than ever. The shadows were fighting valiantly behind him, but the real fight was between him and Steele. It had always been about power, about control, about who would dictate the future. Mason dove into the fray, taking down the guards, his body moving as though it were instinctive. Everything he had learned, every decision he had made had led to this moment. He was fighting for more than survival. He was fighting for something greater, for the freedom of the shadows, for the chance to rewrite the future. As Mason approached Steele, he found himself in a close-quarters confrontation, their faces inches apart, locked in a brutal struggle for control. Steele's hand shot out, grabbing Mason by the throat, squeezing the life from him. Mason gasped, his vision blurring as the pressure mounted. "You were always too weak for this fight, Mason." Steele's voice was a dark whisper in his ear. "Now it's too late." But Mason wasn't going down without a fight. With every ounce of strength he had left, he managed to break free. This was it. Mason saw Steele's eyes widen in shock just before he landed the fatal blow. Steele fell to the ground with a sickening thud, the final remnants of his reign crumbling around him. The world seemed to pause. The dust and chaos around them stilled for just a moment, as though the battle had reached its end. Mason fell to his knees, his breath ragged and shaky. He was exhausted, broken, but he felt something he hadn't felt in so long: peace. The war was over. The shadows had won. And for the first time, Mason had fought not for survival, but for redemption. The final battle had begun to wane, but the city's ruins were far from silent. Smoke still billowed from the remains of Shadow Corp's stronghold, and the wreckage of military vehicles dotted the landscape, their twisted metal serving as grim reminders of the war that had ravaged the city. Mason stood at the heart of the chaos, his bloodied hands trembling as he prepared for the ultimate showdown. Ahead of him lay Colonel Steele and the leadership of Shadow Corp, now completely exposed. The corporation's true face had been revealed. its agenda, its experiments, and its desire for domination. The final moments of Mason's journey had arrived, and this was no longer about survival. It was about stopping the last remnants of tyranny. Mason stood at the edge of a ruined building, gazing out at the fortified compound where Steele and his inner circle awaited. The city surrounding him had become a battleground, but now there was only one task left: destroy the heart of Shadow Corp. Colonel Steele, standing tall in the center of the Shadow Corp leadership, exuded an air of confidence as if he already knew the outcome of this battle. But there was no certainty in Mason's mind. His resolve had hardened. He had already made his choice. He had already sacrificed too much to turn back now. In the distance, the shadows, the survivors, the ones who had fought by Mason's side, moved into position, ready to deliver the final blow. But Mason knew this wouldn't be just a fight for their freedom. This would be a fight for their future, for the survival of something greater than themselves. Mason had spent his life fighting for others, fighting for the missions and orders given to him, never once questioning the price of his compliance. Shadow Corp's grip on the world had been a shadow over his entire existence. But as Mason's journey had unfolded, he had come to see the truth. He was fighting for more than just survival. He was fighting for redemption. The mistakes of his past, the lives lost, the lives he had destroyed by following orders. This battle would be his final chance to right those wrongs. Every step he had taken had led him to this point. The chance to stop Shadow Corp from using the shadows to fuel their agenda of global domination. The cost of fighting for what's right had already been paid in full. Mason had lost friends, allies, and much of his own humanity in the process. But now, in the final moments, he understood. There could be no redemption without sacrifice. Mason was no longer the man who had been content to follow orders. He was a man fighting for freedom, not just for the shadows, but for the future of a world that had long since forgotten the value of human life. As Mason made his way through the debris-strewn streets toward the Shadow Corp headquarters, the scene unfolded before him like a nightmare brought to life. The shadows, no longer just victims but warriors, had already begun their assault on the compound. But Mason knew that the heart of the battle wasn't out there. It was inside, where Steele and the others awaited him. Inside the compound, Steele stood with Director Lansing, General Hayden, and the rest of the Shadow Corp leadership. The men and women who had spent years controlling the world from the shadows. They were calm, calculating, but Mason could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of losing everything they had worked for. Their empire was crumbling, and Mason was the one who had come to tear it down. "You're too late, Mason," Steele said, his voice filled with bitterness. "The shadows are already in our hands. They were never meant to be free. They were tools to be used for our ultimate power. You've lost." Mason's grip on his weapon tightened. "You've lost, Steele." His voice rang out with clarity. "And so has Shadow Corp. It's over. You don't get to control the future anymore." Steele's eyes darkened as he stepped forward, his hand resting on the control panel that would release the final stage of the corporation's project. The glowing red lights indicated that they were close to completing the weaponization of the shadows, the final, irreversible step that would ensure their complete domination. "I've worked too long to let you, and your band of rebels, take this from me," Steele sneered. "This world will fall in line. We will control everything, including the shadows. They will bend to our will, and you'll be just another casualty of the war you couldn't win." Mason's voice was unwavering. "Not today, Steel, not today." The shadows outside clashed against the Shadow Corps soldiers, their supernatural powers unleashing a fierce wave of energy that shattered the walls. Mason charged forward, feeling the weight of his decisions pressing on him. He didn't flinch. This was the moment that would determine the fate of everyone. The fight was brutal. As Mason closed in on Steel, the room shook with the force of the battle outside. The walls cracked and debris fell from the ceiling. But Mason didn't waver. He had come too far. This was his fight, and the last stand was his to make. In one final, desperate move, Steel activated the final weapon, a massive energy pulse aimed directly at the shadows. The air around Mason sparked with the power of it, and for a moment everything slowed down. Time seemed to freeze as the pulse surged toward the shadows. If it hit, the shadows would be obliterated, their rebellion crushed in an instant. But Mason wasn't going to let that happen. He dove forward, sacrificing himself to intercept the blast. Pain shot through him as he took the full force of the energy, feeling his body burn with the intensity of the blast. His body screamed in agony, but he didn't stop. With his last ounce of strength, he aimed his weapon at the control panel, blasting it into oblivion. The pulse stopped. The shadows were saved. Mason collapsed, his vision fading as the fight outside slowly came to a halt. The shadows had won, and Shadow Corp's reign had ended. The battle was over. The dust had settled, but the scars remained. The streets of the city were littered with the remnants of destruction, burnt-out vehicles, broken buildings, and the silence that followed the chaos. The once thriving heart of the city was now a graveyard, filled with the echoes of the conflict that had torn it apart. Mason stood in the middle of the wreckage, looking at the horizon. The sun was rising, casting a dim orange light across the ruins. It was the dawn of a new era, but the air still felt heavy, the weight of the cost of victory. Around him, the shadows were gathering, but they were not celebrating. The war had left them broken and weary, just like Mason. The shadows had won their freedom, but they had paid a steep price. Their bodies bore the marks of the fight. Some were injured, others still struggling to come to terms with the loss of friends and loved ones. Despite their victory, there was no joy in the aftermath. Freedom had come at the cost of lives, both their own and those who had stood against them. As Mason walked through the streets, he saw the faces of those he had fought alongside, the shadows, and those who had helped him in his journey. Some were tending to their wounded, others were quietly mourning their dead. The victory felt hollow, and Mason could feel the ache of his own loss, the sacrifice that had led to this moment. Mason's body still ached from the battle, the physical toll of the final confrontation taking its toll. But it was his mind that was burdened most. He had won, yes, but at what cost? What had all of his sacrifices meant? And could he ever reconcile with the things he had done to get here? The theme of this part revolves around the cost of victory, the price paid in the pursuit of redemption. Mason had spent his entire journey fighting for freedom, for both the shadows and himself. But in the end, freedom came with a heavy burden. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that the cost of everything, the lives lost, the cities destroyed, the betrayals, had overshadowed the hope he had fought for. The shadows, despite their victory, still faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives, just as Mason did. They were free, but the world they faced was a broken world, one that had been shaped by conflict and would never be the same. Mason had always believed that redemption was achievable through action, that if he just fought hard enough, made enough sacrifices, He could make up for his past mistakes. But now, standing in the ruins of everything he had worked to protect, he questioned whether true redemption could ever be attained. What did it all mean if everything that came before had led to such destruction? Victory had a price, and Mason could feel it. As the shadows began to rebuild their lives, Mason knew that they weren't the only ones who had to heal. Humanity itself had been scarred by the events of this war. The lines between man and monster had blurred, and the wounds from this war would not heal quickly. Mason walked toward a makeshift memorial where several shadows had gathered to mourn their fallen comrades. The place was quiet, somber. Tattered flags and military insignia marked the graves, their names etched into the stones. The faces of those who had fought beside him, now gone, weighed heavily on Mason's heart. He knelt beside the memorial, his fingers brushing the names of the fallen. They were victims of the system, people like him, caught in a cycle of violence that seemed impossible to escape. But now the cycle was broken, even if it left a trail of destruction behind. What comes next? Mason whispered to himself, the question echoing through the silence. The shadows had won their freedom, but freedom meant nothing without hope, without direction, without a world to rebuild. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Victor Ramirez, his old comrade, walked up beside him, his face tired but resolute. "We did it, Mason. We're free." Mason nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. "Yeah, we are, but at what cost, Victor? The world is in ruins. We've won, but what do we have left?" Victor didn't answer right away. He looked out at the memorial, his eyes lost in the distance. "The world we build now will be better than the one we had," Victor said quietly. "We can rebuild, we have a chance, but it won't be easy, it never is." Mason stood and walked away from the memorial, his mind swirling with doubt and regret. But there was hope there too. He had fought for this. The shadows had fought for this. And now it was their job to forge a future from the ruins of the past. But was it really worth it? Would the world ever truly be better? The world had changed. The skies over the city were clearer now, the remnants of battle receding into the past, and a quiet optimism settled where only war had reigned before. It was a fresh start, not just for the shadows, but for Mason himself. He had walked through fire, and now the embers were cooling, leaving behind the foundations for a new world. Mason stood at the gates of a newly established community center for the shadows. The walls were adorned with murals depicting their freedom, their struggle, and the reconstruction that had only just begun. It was a small symbol of the much larger change happening across the world. The shadows were no longer hunted or imprisoned. They were free, rebuilding their lives, reclaiming their place in the world. The center itself was bustling with life. Families of shadows were now living here, children running and playing, their laughter filling the air. Mason had helped create this sanctuary, a safe space where the shadows could heal, a place where they could begin anew. Across the room, Victor Ramirez was sitting with a group of shadows, guiding them through the early stages of their new life. There was still much work to do, but the atmosphere was no longer one of despair. It was one of hope. Mason could feel the peace settling in his heart, the kind he had sought for so long. The fight was over. The world was not fixed, but the seeds of a new beginning had been planted. Mason's journey had been long, tumultuous, and filled with loss. But in the end, he had found redemption, not just for himself, but for the shadows too. Redemption was never a simple or linear path, and it had come at a cost, but now, standing amidst the fruits of their labor, Mason understood that redemption wasn't just about undoing the past. It was about creating something better from the ashes. The shadows, once victims of exploitation and abuse, were now reclaiming their dignity, building new lives and becoming a part of society. Their struggle had been long, but they had emerged victorious, not by force, but through their resilience and the courage to fight for what they deserved. Mason's role had shifted from a fighter to an advocate. He wasn't just helping the shadows live freely. He was helping them find meaning in their new lives. The world they were building was not just a refuge. It was a place where they could contribute, thrive, and heal. The redemption Mason had sought for himself was now something that extended beyond him. His journey had taught him that true redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future where mistakes were acknowledged, but they didn't define you. The Shadow's freedom was now the ultimate victory, a victory that had been hard-earned by everyone involved. And it wasn't just about survival. It was about creating a better world for future generations. Mason stood before a small gathering of shadows, his voice calm but filled with passion. "We've all come a long way," he said, the words echoing in the quiet space. "We've faced things we never thought possible, but we're here now. The fight isn't over, but the war is. Now we build together. We rebuild not just our lives, but our world." He paused, scanning the room, catching the eyes of those who had stood with him in battle, those who had suffered the worst of Shadow Corp's oppression. Their faces were no longer full of fear. Now there was a light in their eyes, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. "I'm proud of what we've accomplished," Mason continued, his voice steady. "But I know we can do more. The world may have torn us apart, but now we're going to fix it. We're going to give the shadows a future, a life, and a place in this world. And I'll be here to help make sure that happens." The room was filled with applause, but it wasn't loud or raucous. It was soft, reverent, like the first light of dawn. It was a celebration of survival, yes, but also of peace. Mason stepped down from the podium, his heart swelling with pride. This was it. This was the beginning of something new.